how many of us have heard the expression, you're your own worst enemy? And how, why don't we treat ourselves like we treat everybody else? And I was thinking, I used to hear that almost every day from my mom, and it's much more difficult to take care of yourself, to do those great things. And as we begin to come out of COVID with vaccines becoming more the norm or getting there, um, I was thinking about what is it that people are going to be afraid of getting back. And it was very nice of Jimmy Kimmel to do a little skit the other night of a gentleman who's been sitting Zooming, and now it's ready to go out, and he doesn't know how to put his pants on. And he goes through all the, he wraps it around his leg, he steps over them, and like he's really challenged by just putting his pants on. And then of course it goes on, and then this fear as he goes to touch the doorknob to go out into the world, and not knowing what to expect. There's also been lots of conversations about the COVID-19, similar to the freshman 15. How many of us have added a little girth around the middle of our anatomy? And so, these are the challenges that we're looking for or against. And so Kelly was wonderful in sharing Laura and explaining what she does. And doing good business reminded me of Charlie the tuna. It's not tunas that have good taste, taste good, but have good taste, but tunas that taste good. So it's not about doing business good, but about doing good business. And how do we shift that focus to not only the people we serve, but to ourselves? So Laura brings a lot of experience, 20 years as a consultant. My background is marketing, so I love that she has, kind over matter, because we've all heard about mind over matter, but about kindness and about doing good things for ourselves as well. She has a whole methodology that she's going to be sharing with us. She attended Moravian College, which is, I grew up in Allentown, so we actually did a Model UN there. So as you begin to connect with people, you find that there's so much more we share if we take that opportunity to be kind and open to meeting new people and what they bring. So I am very excited to invite Laura to join with us today. I know I need lots of help with being nicer to myself and treating myself like I treat other people. We are recording the presentation. Her slides will not be shared, but she does have a handout that we will be sharing with everyone following the presentation. And so I welcome Laura, and I welcome all of you to become actively involved so we can all be nicer to ourselves as well as everyone else. So Laura, thank you, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Lori. And Kelly, thank you for the connection. For those of you that just joined, I'll just very quickly introduce myself before I share my screen. So as Lori mentioned, I spent 20 years in corporate. I've been coaching for 7 years. I provide leadership and executive coaching for leaders and companies that have the audacity to bring kindness into business. So that looks like me doing this a lot all day in the last year. And my good thing that has come out of the pandemic, similar to Charlie, I like my husband a lot more than I did a year and a half ago, which is a really nice and quite frankly, unexpected thing that came out of this last year. So with that, let me share my screen for everyone. And I will just make sure, Lori, give me a high sign so I know that you all are seeing. Perfect. I can see on my screen, and now I'm going to minimize you so I don't look like I'm looking in weird directions. So we today are going to talk about, as Lori said, how to manage our inner critic with kindness. My goal for our time together is to teach you some simple tools that you can take with you out into the world, whether that's virtual or in person, that help you manage your inner critic differently than most of us are managing it today. So the journey that we're going to take today is going to start with some myth busting. And then we're going to learn a little bit about what actually is this voice? What is it? Where does it come from? Why the heck is it hanging around in my head all the time? We're going to go through the typical responses, the way almost everyone on the planet is responding to this critical inner voice. I'll share a little bit about the cost of those responses, and then we'll get into the new way. How do we want to navigate this inner critical voice? And what are the benefits of working with that voice differently in this kinder, more compassionate way? I'm going to go through some FAQs. In the multiple times that I have done this workshop, there are some questions that recur. So I've put them together with some answers for everyone. We'll have time for real Q&A as well. And then if there's anyone that wants to volunteer and do a little bit of brave real-time work together on their inner critic, we'll have some time at the end for that as well. So with that, let's start by busting the myth. So I am not Jamie from Mythbusters. I am a person who spends her days with a lot of other people. I've always been fascinated by human beings. Lori mentioned I went to Moravian College. My undergraduate degree is a dual major in psychology and sociology. So people are really my passion and what has driven me my entire adult life. So what I am here to tell you today is that every person on the planet has an inner critic. That means I do, that means Kelly does, that means Beyonce does, that means, David Hasselhoff does, anyone that you want to think of. Everyone on the planet has an inner critic. And I always start this workshop by sharing that because so many of us go through life thinking, ooh, gosh, it's probably just me. Why am I so hard on myself? Why can't I figure this out? Like we have it all together. That person has it all together. They must have this figured out. Gosh, what is wrong with me? So if you take nothing else from our time today, give yourself the exhale to recognize that you are not alone. Every human that you encounter has this inner critical voice. And there is nothing wrong with you. You are not a flawed human because this voice exists inside you. You're actually more normal than maybe you realize. Why do we have this voice? So there's two common schools of thought. And as Kelly can attest, I often on the podcast will say, I am a dramatic oversimplifier. So any sort of, biology, neurology, brain science that you hear from me today, please understand is going to intentionally be a dramatic oversimplification. So the dramatic oversimplification of why we have this inner critical voice really comes down to nature and nurture. So if we think about the nature side of it, the inner critic voice is based on our old friend fear. So fear is probably one of the oldest evolutionary parts of the human brain, the human existence. It lives in the amygdala, which if you're not familiar with the brain is pretty deep in there. It's a little tiny nugget right in the center towards the back. It controls our fight, flight, freeze, appease mechanism. And it's really the thing that has kept humans evolving and alive through the millennia. So fear, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years ago, looked like humans needing to stay safe from saber-toothed tigers, outrunning, prey or outrunning predators for whom humans were prey. But it's 2021 and we're all looking at each other through a screen. We have tiny computers in our pockets that also allow us to make phone calls. Why do we still have this fear? Well, I'll offer that fear is actually beneficial, even though we are no longer outrunning saber-toothed tigers. If we didn't have fear, we would all be running into traffic. We would be jumping off of cliffs without parachutes. So there is very clearly still a need and an evolutionary component of fear. But because it's 2021 and we're not trying to outrun predators anymore, the fear shows up as a critical inner voice. Brain science, dramatic oversimplification. Our brains are not meant to make us happy. They are meant to keep us safe. And the simplest way to understand it now is that safety equals sameness. So we'll talk a little bit about when your critic comes up, when it gets loudest, and thinking about that concept of my brain is here to keep me safe. And because I don't have to worry about somebody eating me anymore, safety is now equated to sameness. So that's the nature side of things. The other school of thought and component, and like anything else, I am a big believer in the combination of nature and nurture. So whatever topic that you're talking about, I always believe that both components are present and have a role. The inner critic is no exception. Lori alluded to this a little bit earlier. Sometimes our inner critical voice is actually the voice that was given to us by a parent or early caregiver. Now, one of the things I also believe is that everyone is doing the best they can. Our parents were doing the best that they could. I am, you are, for those of you in the audience that are parents, we're all doing the best that we can. So when we talk about this voice coming from a parent or early caregiver, it's not in a critical way. It's really in the way that little kid brain, 5-year-old kid brain doesn't understand when a parent says something that maybe they mean in a loving, supportive way. The little kid brain doesn't have the executive functioning developed yet to be able to say, oh, that parent just cares about me. So maybe when you were in school, you brought home a B on a paper or a report card, and your dad said, oh, next time maybe you can get an A. Well, dad probably meant, I believe in you so much that I think you're capable of an A, but maybe little kid brain has interpreted that to think, I'm not good enough unless I get an A. Dad will only love me if I get all A's, if I do things perfectly. So that's the nurture component of it. Some people are actually so clear on that voice, they can say, oh, this is my mother's voice. This is my father's voice. They can identify who told them that story that's now their critical inner voice. For other people, it's a little bit more vague. And we'll talk about how to identify that voice a little bit later this morning, but really think about those two components. So the nature side, it's fear, it's part of our evolutionary process. It really, truly does have value. Our brain is just trying to keep us safe. Its mechanisms are just a little questionable. And then the nurture side of it, little kid brains that lack executive functioning simply can't interpret what someone says to us in a loving way as being loving. It sometimes interprets and it gets encoded in our brain as that critical inner voice. So your critic might sound like any of these things. You may have a harsh or hostile critic. You may have a critic. Lori was sharing a story before some folks joined about how she received feedback a long time ago in her career that everyone interpreted how she was talking about as having the word stupid at the end, even though, of course, that wasn't something that she was conveying with her voice. But your inner critic may be really similar. It may be harsh or hostile. It may say, oh, you're so stupid. You should never apply for that job. You're never going to win that proposal. Why are you even trying? What's wrong with you? There's so many people better at what you do in the world. I'm thinking of Kevin. There's a million wealth managers, Kevin. Why are they going to work with you? So your critic may be harsh or hostile or downright mean. Your critic might be sarcastic. Maybe your critic is like, ugh, please, why even bother? What's the point? Don't even worry about it. You don't need to do that. Anything that tells you or talks you out of not going for something that you want is a part of that inner critical voice. So think about, as we're talking about these, how yours shows up if you can identify it. Is it sarcastic? Does that feel true to you? Or maybe it's highly logical. And I think about this, there's so much data on applications and applying for jobs and the jobs that folks who identify as women will apply to versus jobs that folks who identify as men will apply to. And really the studies show that women are much more critical of themselves and their skills and will only apply to jobs that have 80%, that they have 80% of the qualifications for. And men, it's much lower. I want to say it's like 40% that men will apply for the job if they feel they're 40% qualified. That can be a form of the inner critic, that highly logical voice that tells you, ooh, gosh, Laura, you're missing those two nice to have skills. You probably shouldn't apply. Your resume is going to go to the bottom of the pile. They're not even going to look at you. There's no point. Don't worry about applying for that. Just apply for the job that you're overqualified for. That's a safer move. Remember safety. No matter how your inner critic sounds, whether it's mean, it's harsh and hostile, whether it's sarcastic and it's maybe, kind of jabbing you or ribbing you or making jokes, or whether it's highly logical, the goal of that critic is to keep you safe. Safe equals same. If I don't apply for the job, everything stays the same. I don't risk being hurt by being rejected, or even worse, by having to succeed at something that feels a little bit like a stretch to me. So think about your critic personally. and which form it might take when it's trying to talk you out of doing something. The ways that we typically respond might look a lot like these two kangaroo friends that are really going at each other. So when you think about the typical response to the inner critic, a lot of people get angry or frustrated that this voice even exists. Like, oh, there's that stupid voice again. Oh, I'm so angry. I'm 44 years old. Why am I still dealing with this voice? What is wrong with me? I can't believe I'm still dealing with this. I don't know why I can't get past this. Anger and frustration is a very typical response to that inner critic voice. So is fighting back. There's a lot of, books and articles and posts on the internet about, becoming fearless or, fighting the inner critic, even the way other people talk about that critical voice. People want to label it the monster or the gremlin or, the jerky neighbor. There's all kinds of people that really want to fight back against the critic. It's a very typical response. We'll talk about the cost to those responses, but just know if this is what you've learned or this is what you've experienced, it's incredibly normal. I mean, really, there's a ton of people in my world, in the coaching world, and even in the therapeutic world that talk about, the inner jerk and like kicking the critic to the curb. I don't actually believe that's real because this critic is rooted in a fear response that we need evolutionarily. What I believe in is that we can work with it. And that's what we're going to learn to do together today. So finally, some people try to suppress it. Maybe they put it in a box. That's what works for you to do the hard thing. If you are doing any of these things or any other ways that you are coping and working with your inner critic right now, just know that it's okay. You're not doing anything wrong. Even if you're fighting the critic, even if you're shoving it down and trying to suppress it, even if you're really angry and frustrated when it shows up, what you are doing is the best that you can. And if you suppress the critic or you fight back for a minute, and that's the strategy that lets you do the hard thing, like maybe you need to suppress it so that you can hit apply on a job that feels like a stretch to you. Maybe you need to fight back for a minute so that you can go have the difficult conversation. If that's what you're doing in the moment, then absolutely, if it's working for you, don't feel that you have to give it up. But just know that there's a cost. Research on stress shows us that a certain amount of stress is actually healthy. It motivates us. It can push us to do things. The same is true for the critic in that typical response. So if you know that you can compartmentalize the critical voice, or if you can kind of fight it for a second and push it aside so that you can do the hard thing, in the moment, full permission to do that. But the cost over time is increased stress. And the cost of increased stress, as I'm sure we all know, it's higher cortisol levels in our body. It's exhaustion. It's burnout. It's, cortisol creates inflammation. Inflammation creates illness. We all know that stress is really not our friend. So over time, if the only tool that you have to deal with a critic is a stress-based response, it's fighting it, it's pushing it down, it's trying to ignore it, it's being angry at yourself because this critic still exists, there is a cost over time. Your stress will go up. And as anyone can tell you, when stress is high, confidence is low. So these are long-term costs of only having this one typical way of dealing with the critic. Our cortisol goes up because our stress level goes up. Our confidence goes down. All of the happy brain chemicals that we all love to feel good, they go right down when we are constantly fighting that inner part of ourselves. So let's try this instead. Let's try an approach with the inner critic that is based in kindness. It's based in compassion. It's also rooted in some research, and I promise I'll get to that. But I want to offer you a new tool and a new option. We all know how to fight that difficult voice. We all know how to push it down and suppress it and try and pretend it doesn't exist or try and wish it away. What I'm going to offer you is the opportunity to engage with the voice, to work with it in a loving, compassionate way. Think of that little kid that maybe misinterpreted something a parent or a caregiver shared with them. And that misinterpretation has become the critical inner voice. Deal with that voice like you would deal with that little kid. Let's try this instead. There is actually a lot of research on kindness and self-compassion. There is an amazing book called Self-Compassion. It's by a woman named Dr. Kristen Neff. She has TED Talks. You can check her out all over the world on the internet. She is, in my mind, really the leading researcher in the self-compassion space. So the research that Dr. Neff has done has shown that people who are self-compassionate are mentally healthier. They're more resilient. I think I heard almost every person this morning in their introduction touch on resilience. In the last year, we've seen folks really struggle with their resilience. It's been a hard year. And I love that we all had a chance to share something positive that's come out of the last year, because that speaks to resilience. So does self-compassion. A huge component of being more resilient is being kind and compassionate to yourself, just like you would be kind and compassionate to anyone else that you love. So self-compassionate people are also better able to cope with difficult situations. Think about the hard conversation. Think about taking a big risk. Think about, doing something new. Think about all of the stress that we're starting to feel when we're talking about returning to work, returning to in-person. All of these difficult situations are much easier to cope with when we are self-compassionate. Not surprising, people who are compassionate to themselves are also more caring in relationships. So when I am kinder to myself, I am kinder to my partner, to my friends, to my family, because I'm already rooted in that compassionate space. So it's a natural extension of how I treat myself. And people who are self-compassionate tend to take better care of their physical health. And this last part is my favorite. They strive to meet goals because they want to reach their full potential. So I shared with all of you a little while ago that I spend my days talking to leaders. I spend my days working with people that are driven, that are successful. And to debunk another myth, the number one myth in driven, successful people is that they are successful because they are hard on themselves. And the number one fear is if I'm not mean to myself, if I don't push myself with that really challenging, almost aggressive inner critical voice, I'll never accomplish anything again. I call it the refrigerator box fear, because at the bottom of the fear, everybody's scared that they're going to end up living in a refrigerator box on the street because they're going to lose everything that they've worked so hard for. Research actually shows that people who are compassionate with themselves, that treat themselves with kindness, are still striving to meet their goals. They are just as successful, if not more so, but they're striving to meet their goals because they want to reach their full potential, not because they're trying to prove something to themselves. So that critical inner voice, for a lot of folks, it shows up as some flavor of not good enough, not smart enough, not, whatever enough. And that does push to a certain extent. Think about the stress tipping point. That inner critic voice will push you to do a certain amount of things. But while it's pushing you, your stress is going up. Your confidence is degraded. Self-compassionate people are meeting those same goals. They're striving for excellence, not perfection, because they believe in themselves and they want to reach their full potential. So it's a shift from, I have to do that to feel like I'm good enough, into, I know I'm capable of doing that and I want to do it. It's a subtle but incredibly powerful shift. And that is the second myth that I will debunk for you today. So just trust. I will ask you for your trust in sharing that for years and years, I have never, ever, ever had anyone stop achieving goals simply because they have become more self-compassionate. So let's get really tactical. How do we do it? I'm going to teach you my framework. It's super simple. It's called the 3 N's. And this is really what to do when that critical inner voice comes up, when, you feel like that negative voice is there. Maybe it's the voice that you've identified from a parent or caregiver. Maybe it's, just a little bit of fear coming up in the background. However you notice it for yourself, you can use the 3 N's to navigate through it and work with it in a new way. So the first N is notice. And noticing is really why I've asked you a couple of times to think about, what does your critic sound like? When does it come up for you? How do you know it's present? Maybe you can clearly articulate what it says to you. Maybe it's just a subtle feeling of nervousness in your body when you're going to do a hard thing. We talk about the somatic experience. Somatic means of the body. Maybe you notice your critic is coming up because your shoulders get really tense and they go up into your ears. Maybe for you, it's a little bit of shakiness or some churning in your stomach. Maybe you do have a really clear tape that runs in your head of that critical voice. So the first step in anything is always to notice. We need to cultivate that awareness, that self-awareness of what our critic says, when it shows up, how it feels, what triggers it, and how do I know it's there? So think about your own critical experience. When is it showing up most for you? What is the last time that you can clearly remember that critical inner voice showing up? And this is just practice. Everything that we're going to do is with the spirit of curiosity. There is no wrong way to do any of this work. However you notice and cultivate that self-awareness is the right way to do it. And our second step is naming it. I have been referring to the inner critic as the inner critic this whole time. I do not believe that it is healthy to name it a monster, to name it, the jerk that takes up space in your brain, even to name it the gremlin. I actually believe in just really taking all of that negative energy out of it. The reason I use the phrase inner critic in my work is because it's a neutralized name. It's simply a label for what this voice is. I also know that certain people can get some help by giving it an actual name. I have a client who she named her critic Bertha. And when she notices Bertha is showing up, she can name it. She can say, oh, Bertha's here. Bertha's a little louder right now. Bertha's kind of amplified. So if that's a tool that works for you, take what you want and leave the rest. Maybe that feels a little bit corny to you and you're not into naming this voice in your head. But the benefit of naming it, even if you simply say, oh, I notice my inner critic is coming up. The benefit of naming it is that it creates that distance. Before we identify it, before we notice it and identify it as the critic or whatever name you want to assign to it, we have the tendency to believe that it's our truth. It can feel like an identity. That critical inner voice of not good enough can really feel like I am not good enough. When you name it and you can clearly say to yourself, oh, I notice that's my critical voice. Bertha's here. She's trying to tell me I'm not good enough again. It immediately reduces the power that that voice has over you. I like to use the analogy of driving in a car. Before you can notice and name the critical inner voice, that voice is often what's driving. You might be a passenger just along for the ride. You might sometimes feel like you're running behind the car trying to catch up. But when you notice and name the critical inner voice, you become the driver. The critic is still going to be there. The critic is going to be some days next to you in the passenger seat. Some days it's going to be in the trunk and you might almost forget that it's there. And some days it's going to be reaching from the back seat, trying to grab the steering wheel and trying to take control again. And when those days happen, we want to implement the third N, which is nurture. Nurture that critical voice the same way you would nurture that 5-year-old kid. For those of you that are parents, a great way to practice this nurturing step is think about how you would deal with your kiddo if they were scared. Imagine when your kiddo was in the single digit ages and that kiddo came to you and was super scared and, was maybe freaking out. And sometimes that looks like acting out. Sometimes when little kids are scared, it comes off as aggressive. It comes off as frustrated, just like our critics do. You would never, ever tell that scared little kid to just shut up. You would never call it a monster or a gremlin or the jerk that lives in the house. You would nurture it. You would probably give the kiddo a hug. You would probably let them share a little bit of what they're feeling, and you would help calm them down. Think about de-escalating the nervous system. Maybe you would help the kid take a deep breath. Maybe if you would give the kid a hug, you need to put a hand on your hand to nurture yourself in the moment, to really feel that somatic connection to yourself. But when we nurture that critical voice, instead of fighting it or instead of calling it names, we become the one that's in the driver's seat. We become more emotionally agile, more able to deal with difficult situations because we're de-escalating the fear and the stress response. So notice the critic, get that separation. Notice that it is not you. It is not your identity. Name it for what it is. Give it a corny name if you want. I only ask that you name it with kindness. Either give it a human name, but please do not name it the jerk. But give it a name so that you can separate yourself from it and then nurture it when it comes up. Nurture that critical inner voice just like you would nurture a scared little kid. Yourself, when you heard that you should have gotten an A instead of a B. What did you really need to hear from your parent at that point? And how can you nurture yourself in that same way now? So this simple 3-step practice can be used anytime that critical voice comes up. So whether you notice it as a script in your head, or you notice it as a feeling in your body, or maybe it's just kind of vague and you notice hesitation to do something really difficult, name it for what it is in the moment and nurture yourself through the moment. As you do this work, your critic will evolve. I promise. I have been doing this work for years and it will evolve in both positive and challenging ways. It will evolve by showing up a little bit less. It will evolve by being a little bit quieter when it shows up. It will evolve by shortening the time between noticing it and being able to nurture yourself. Right now, as you first start this, it's probably going to feel a little bit uncomfortable and it might take you longer to get to the point of knowing the tools that really help you through the nurturing. But soon it will evolve and you'll know your practices, you'll know what works for you, and you'll be able to get to that nurturing point to de-escalate that fear response in your body. It also might get a little trickier. Maybe your critic is really mean and then it evolves to be sarcastic, or maybe it becomes highly logical. It's okay. The critic is just doing its job. No matter how it shows up, it's trying to keep you safe. Old brain equates safety with sameness. But if you keep nurturing it, if you keep being compassionate to that scared part of you, you get to stay in the driver's seat. You get to calm down and you get to have the critic be the passenger instead of the critic being the driver. So I want to pause just for a moment before I get into some of the frequently asked questions and see if anyone has any questions that have come up for them so far. I'm going to open the chat so that I can see it. So just for a moment, if there's any questions that you've had so far, feel free to put them in the chat before we get into some of the general questions that come up in this kind of work.
Or because we're so small, if you want to just wave your hand and get Laura's attention. If you're like me, it's easier to ask questions.
Yeah, shout it out.
So Laura, how successful are people in being able to conquer their inner critic? Because as I'm listening to this, I'm like, yes, I do that. Yes, I do that. Is there really hope for me to get out of that cycle?
Yeah, so I think that the fallacy in that idea is that it will someday go away. because this critic is rooted in fear, it's rooted in, the oldest part of the brain, then we still actually need it. It's just showing up a little bit sideways. I think that the measure of success is, can we work with it? Can I go longer between, the critic showing up and the critic showing up again? Can I more quickly get to that point of nurturing myself and de-escalating the stress response so that I can move forward with confidence? That, I think, is really the true measure of success. So I hate to tell people that they can't actually become fearless, but I really believe it's important to know that the myth of fearless is just that. It's just a myth. Like, really, we shouldn't be fearless, because again, we'd all be running into traffic or jumping off of mountains without parachutes. Great question. So Lori, that was a great cue up, because a lot of these questions kind of revolve around that similar question. So a frequent question is, what can we do to accept our flaws and still have the resolve to work on the issues that we want to address? And I love this question because the answer is rooted in it. Accepting our flaws and approaching ourselves with that curiosity. How do you debunk the myth of pushing myself really hard and being kind of mean to myself is the only thing that makes me successful? How do you get curious enough to be able to still work on moving yourself forward, still resolve things that you want to address while accepting yourself for who you are? I like to think about taking action. And when are you more likely to take action? If you think about the last year, I know I've personally had days where I felt great and I was like, pandemic, what? Things are going really well. And I've had days that were really, really hard. And I really had to work on my own self-compassion to be able to work through those days. The days that I was more able to, work on issues and to focus on my growth and to just take action were the days that I felt good. Yet we have this fallacy that if we don't constantly look at our flaws, we're never going to succeed. So think about yourself. And I would bet that you're pretty similar to me in that you're most likely to do the thing that you want to do when you're feeling good. So work with your critic in this positive, kind, self-compassionate way and just get curious. Are you actually able to accomplish more? Are you able to debunk the fallacy of I have to be hard on myself to succeed for yourself? So give it a try. There was a study, believe it or not, and it's actually still early in the year. I think pandemic time is kind of slippery. So when I think about New Year's resolutions, it feels like a million years ago. It's still March. So most of you probably don't remember your resolutions if you even make them, but a lot of people make them. Studies shown that by January 12th, most people have already abandoned them. So how do you stay motivated when, most people have abandoned New Year's resolutions by January 12th? And how can we combat the negative self-talk when we feel like we're not accomplishing goals as quickly as we should? So for me, this question is, keep your eyes on your own paper. And Kelly and I just had a guest on the podcast that talked all about collaboration. And 100% in business and in partnerships and in the professional world, collaboration is the way to go. But when you notice yourself comparing and comparison are two very different things. So if you notice comparison coming up, if you notice a should coming into your head, that's the moment to come back to yourself. Come back to your goals, come back to your values, do a little bit of notice, name, nurture, and just take yourself through that de-escalation process. Speak to yourself compassionately when the negative talk comes up, and then move forward. Take the step out of that calm, compassionate place, not out of that stressful place where you're feeling like you have to be mean to yourself to move forward.
Before you go on, Laura, does it have anything to do with the type of goals that you set? I know from other personality tests, I love all those things.
Yeah, me too.
Some people set small goals because it's really important that they achieve it. Other people set really huge goals because they shoot for the moon when you fall amongst the stars.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have an impact on our inner critics where we set those goals or how we set them?
Yeah, and I love that. I think that self-awareness in setting goals is really key. And even if you are a, set the goal, to reach the moon kind of person, we still have to break it down into bite-sized chunks. Like I currently right now do not know how to get to the moon. So if I'm literally setting a goal to go to the moon, just to use a silly example, I still have to figure out what the next step is. So for me, I think the critic is less, I'm going to use the word triggered, even though it's terribly overused, but if the critic is less, the critic is likely to be less triggered when you have a next step that's very clear to you. So maybe going to the moon feels like, oh, I have no idea how to do that. That's light years away from me. But I do know that I have a friend that's done some consulting work in, the NASA space of the world. So I can reach out to him. And that's a great first step. And that is much more achievable than trying to sit down and say, well, you have to go to the moon or you're never going to be successful because look at those three people. And this really speaks to this question. Look at those other three people that just made it to the moon. And what's wrong with you that you can't make it to the moon? So if you feel like setting big goals really serves you, I would encourage you to also make sure that you've got clear bite-sized chunks, because that will help you move through things with confidence and not feeling so stressed and critical because maybe other people figured it out, quote unquote, faster. Does that help a little bit, Lori?
It's great. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And I'll also share with this question that jealousy, because this question speaks to jealousy, jealousy can actually be an indicator. So if you see, and social media is like famous for triggering jealousy in people. Social media can make us feel jealous, but what if you looked at jealousy as an indicator? Maybe you see someone speaking at a conference and you're really jealous that they got chosen for it. All that means is that that is a goal that you have. Maybe you want to be a speaker at that conference or a conference of that size. Fantastic. That's a goal you can set for yourself. What is the bite-sized chunk of that goal that you can set for yourself to move closer to it? So if jealousy does come up, flip the relationship with it and recognize that it's actually a goal that you have for yourself. It maybe is a value or an unmet need. And just get curious and compassionate. Label it for what it is, notice it, name it as jealousy, recognize that jealousy actually means that there's a goal that you have for yourself, and then nurture yourself to de-escalate the stress response so that you can take that confident next step to figure out how to be a speaker at that conference.
Laura, real quick, I noticed that Trisha had her hand raised.
Oh, thank you so much, Trisha. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't actually see your amazing faces.
Trisha.
Yeah, I was trying to get myself off mute. I actually just wanted to confirm what Laura was speaking about with the comparison thing, because I'm, as real time as you can, dealing with it a little bit this morning. And what I really had to stop and think about was the way that I say things and present things and interact with people is my own unique style. I really had to talk myself through this and think through it to get to this point. And that's the thing that's unique, because my thing is wanting to be very unique in what I'm working on and presenting or working with clients on, and not just repackage something that somebody else has done previously.
Yeah.
And every time I see something, I think I have a unique thought, and then I see somebody else is doing it, I tend to get a little bit comparison. But I have to constantly remind myself, and this is the way that I'm kind of reframing and getting myself settled, is that we may be talking about the same content, but the way that I will say it, the experiences that I bring to it, my personal style, my personality and everything is unique to me, because there's only one me. So there's lots of doctors in the world that do the same thing, but those doctors aren't going to be doctors for everybody.
Yeah.
Same thing. So I just wanted to, that was a thought that I had, Laura.
Trisha, are you open to doing so? I'm just checking, in the interest of time, I'd actually love to do like a little real-time critical work, and you open the door, and please feel free to say no. If it is not a full body yes, that is absolutely just as welcome. A no is welcome too. But any interest in playing with that a little bit?
I would
no
say
is
yes.
Okay.
No, not this morning, but
Okay.
Normally I'm game for that kind of thing.
Totally okay. And thank you so much for your true and honest no. That is much more important. And thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really important reframe to recognize when you see or you feel jealousy in yourself, or you notice that coming up, remembering exactly that you are your own unique person. There's a million people out there. I've quoted the work of several people just in the last 40 minutes, but maybe someone identifies with me more than them, or them more than me. I think about this a lot, especially with new business owners. You get into the space where you're recognizing, ooh, there's a lot of coaches, or there's a lot of wealth managers, or there's a lot of strategic planners. Every person that's ever graduated a professional organization feels the same way. Every doctor is graduating with dozens, if not hundreds of other physicians that all have to get out there. Does that mean that they're not going to find work? Pretty often it does not. For the most part, people who are graduating med school are practicing medicine. So just remembering that what you bring to your work, of course, you have peers and you have people that are doing the same thing. There's not a profession in the world. I truly believe there's no original ideas. Like, we're all just bringing our own flavor to work and ideas that are already out there. And your unique flavor is what's actually going to attract people to you doing the work.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the final question that always comes up is, how do you channel negative thoughts into positive thoughts? And for this, I'm going to add some nuance. So I think that we so often live in a binary world, right? It's either negative or positive. It's good or bad. It's on or off. And this is actually a process. And research has shown, there's another great book I love called Emotional Agility. It's by Susan David. And the research that she's done, and many, many, many others, really show that a full, healthy human experience includes all spectrums of emotions. So do we have some control over how we think? Absolutely. We can impact ourselves and our mindset and our positivity, but we don't do it by, pretending that we don't have negative thoughts, by coming out, or by being aggressive and mean to ourselves. So the first step is, again, just noticing it. We're going to use the 3 N's. I'm going to notice that's a negative thought. I want to name it for what it is. And then I want to nurture myself through it. And then I can open up my field of view and see what else is happening. So maybe there's something really challenging going on in your life. Maybe there's a health challenge, or, something going on with a family member. It is a normal, healthy human experience to feel some challenging emotions around that. It is also not healthy to brood and to stay in that place and to get stuck in that place. But we need to allow ourselves to process it, to nurture ourselves through it. And then we can expand the view to say, okay, what else is still good? I still have this wonderful home. I still have, this profession. I still have all of these other positive things. So I would offer to this question, allowing space for the negative thought without getting stuck in it. And the more you actually engage with it using the 3 N's, the more easily you move through it. It's when we shove things down or we are aggressive with ourselves that they tend to get amplified.
Laura, can I share a personal example on that?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to stop my share and just come back and let us chat for the last few minutes.
So there have been 2 times in my life, one a long time ago, one more recently, where I had to actually, and I'll put this under the heading of nurture my inner critic, but I had to entertain my inner critic. I had to kind of metaphorically say, clearly, you're trying to tell me something. Why don't you sit over here and lay it on me, right? And I just mentally went through what were all of my worst fears associated with what was I thinking about. I let that play out and paint that picture. And when it distilled down for me in both cases, I was like, yeah, but see, I don't want that. And so then it became the choice. And then I was able to paint a completely new picture of what I did want. Because even in that worst case scenario painting, I was like, really, that's not so bad because I could do this. Really, that's not so bad because I could do this. Oh, yeah, well, what if I didn't have the house? Well, then I would live somewhere else. Like those were the thoughts that kept, coming back. And in that way, I didn't realize it at the time until you used the word nurture, but I was nurturing the inner critic going, see, it's okay.
Yeah.
Right. So what started out was inviting it to face my own kind of fears around that became me quelling the inner critic that way. But I think it was just very helpful to me. And I don't recommend it for everyone, but it was a tough process, but it really helped me I now have a 30-year-old who's allowed to go outside of the house because I went through this process when he was like this big, and I was like, wow, I can't not ever let you out of the house. Like, so I'm going to have to get okay with what might happen to you if I do as you grow up, right? And when I went through some of those scenarios, I realized that in my calmer state, because I was just having an imaginary conversation, which I think Laura will understand as also an only child. I'm really good at the imaginary conversation with someone else. So it was a really helpful process to me.
Yeah,
And
I love
thank you
that
for
example,
your kind
Kelly, and
words.
thank you. And I think that, so often when that voice of fear comes up, we put up a brick wall.
Mhm.
And the beauty of using this process and what Kelly just described is it's no longer a brick wall, it's a speed bump. It's there, you feel it, you notice it, maybe you like jostled in your car a little bit, but you're not stopped.
Right.
And I just did something similar with a client the other day. She's been looking for a position for a while, really stressful, has suddenly found herself having 2 offers. And now the stress is like, how am I going to let them go? How am I going to have the difficult conversation? When to say yes? And all of the, the questions that come along with that. And we just went through it. I said, what is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is that you have to have one difficult conversation.
Right.
And she's like, oh, right. Thanks for that. So when you notice it, right? So notice it for what it is. Like the critic is coming up, fear is coming up, name it. So you get a little separation. This isn't my truth. This is just a piece that's going on over here on the side. And then nurture yourself through it. How do I shift out of this? How do I start to calm myself and de-escalate so that I can move forward from that healthy place? So any questions before we wrap off? And I apologize that I'm not able to stay for the networking at the end. I have to jump in a couple of minutes, but I want to have time for any questions.
So Laura, I think there's another piece to it. I mean, there's the one part that's the negative that, we get kind of stuck in the quagmire about. But I was also raised, you don't brag. You don't pat yourself. False, self-praise is false praise, or, there's some things that, come easily to some people. So you kind of diminish, oh, well, everybody can do that, but I can't do that. And everybody else can do that except me. So how do you balance that inner turmoil between giving yourself a legitimate, I know some people who like are totally disconnected, like you can't do that. I don't know why you think you can. But how do you do that internally where you battle those kind of demons?
Yeah. So confidence and arrogance are 2 different things. That's the first thing I'll say. Like you can recognize, and something that really helped me, somebody that I really look up to and view as a mentor had said a long time ago, don't discount the things that come easy to you. And I think that is so true. Like we all have natural gifts. Tricia alluded to it earlier, the way that we package our message and speak about what we do, that's our natural gift. And Lori, yours is very different than mine, is very different than Charlie's, is very different than Kevin's. And that's what makes it beautiful. So confidence and arrogance are so far apart. We want to think that, ooh, if I feel good about myself, I'm actually going to veer into that place of arrogance. What's true, and we'll debunk another myth here, what's true is that confident humility is a really powerful tool. And no human that has ever feared going into that arrogant place, in my experience, has ever actually gone there. Because even just by asking that question, it tells me that you're coming from a place of humility and that you're not going to dip you're not going to become the flaming narcissist. You're not going to dip into that space of being arrogant and people saying like, oof, that Lori got too big for her britches. So we can be confident there's a ton of space in between. Like, let's get out of that binary that I have to be one or the other. There's so much space in between those 2. Charlie, go ahead.
Yes. In my work with people over the years, I realized that a big factor in what holds them back is a lack of self-awareness. And many people aren't willing to take a deeper dive and really explore, what are my beliefs? What are they based on? What are my values? Because what happens, we adopt other people's view of the world.
For sure.
Whether it's an employer, whether it's family, whether it's our social groups. And it's really not us. And it creates a conflict. And it causes us to doubt. And then we become very susceptible to any kind of external criticism or questioning of our motives or our abilities. It just aggravates it. So when people get very clear about themselves, what they are and what they're not, what I've learned is this confidence emerges and this self-criticism goes down, and they're able to perform at much higher levels and take risks without fear of being put down by people, including themselves. We bring most of this on ourselves. I get the science of, fearing the saber-toothed tiger, if you will. I understand that. We all have that. But at the same time, so much of what holds us back is self-manufactured. It's how we're reacting to what's happening around us.
And that's why we can change it. It's that's the pro and the con summed up beautifully. You have the power to change it, and you have the power to create it.
Right. And too many people don't change it because they're afraid of what other people are going to say or what other people are going to think about. Just think about the anxiety around family gatherings because we may not be living up to the expectations they have for us and for our behavior and for what we've chosen to do in life or who we've chosen to be with in life. And the more we know ourselves and what nurtures and feeds us, the less that critic has control over us.
Well said.
To build on what Charlie said, my own experience in life is that big shadow lurking over my shoulder is created by something that's only that big.
Yeah.
That's great. I like that, David. I like that.
Charlie, you make a great point, and, I'll use my example here briefly is you had mentioned about family gatherings that brings an element of anxiety that you haven't lived up to expectations. While that's true, absolutely, you could also say that it develops an anxiety because you've achieved so much more than what your family has achieved. And I bring that up because I look different than my family. I grew up in Palmyra, up near Hershey, very, very blue collar family, very blue collar. And here I am running a large wealth management practice. I don't look like the rest of my family. So that in itself brings an element of anxiety, an element of, Laura, jealousy, right? That will be taken out on me at times, mainly by my older brother who's 50. He doesn't have that. And there's an element of resentment and an element of jealousy there that absolutely stews and festers with me, drives me nuts because I can't control how they behave, right? All I can do is control how I react to that, but it does absolutely drive me bonkers sometimes and create an element of anxiety with that.
What I'm hearing you say is that you have compassion for them, that you understand where they're coming from. And because you may have evolved away from that, doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just that they haven't had the kinds of opportunities to grow that you have had. And you've taken advantage of it for whatever reason. And they're still your family. They'll always be your family. But, when you think about it, you have become that person they may never have thought you could have become. But inside, you knew there was a better version of yourself. And you allowed yourself to do it. You may have pushed back the noise that you kept hearing from people, and you accomplished it. So congratulations on that. We're all fighting those demons.
So I just popped the handout into the chat, and Lori and Zoe also have it if anyone has trouble downloading it from Zoom. But I just wanted to thank you all. And Kelly, thank you for the intro. Lori, thank you for being my new friend. Thank you all for hanging out for the last hour. And again, I apologize that I'm not able to stay for the rest of the networking, but thank you again. And
thank you, Laura.
Use the 3 M's.
So Laura, thank you very, very much. I know that I'm going to come up with a new name and have a conversation with me later and an ongoing one.
Sweet little Lori, just give her some love.
Sometimes she needs it and sometimes she can give it. But thank you so much for joining us and giving us a lot to think about. And as a new friend, we hope you consider joining Beacon, and I'm sure we'll be reaching out with our interviews. So thank you and a wonderful day and week. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Take care. Kel, I'll talk to you tomorrow.
You got it, Laura.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
So this is our time for networking. We can continue conversation. I think we're very lucky that we have folks who are knowledgeable in this area as well, so that we have lots of good voices to reach out to share. And again, I think that's one of the great things about Beacon is the opportunity to kind of drop our barriers a little bit and to reach out and to know that there's a very nurturing, very caring, supportive community. So I'd like to open it up to anybody who would like to share something, either to ask for help, give help, share an opinion, or talk about anything else that's of interest and priority to you today.
Well, before we do that, Lori, Kevin ought to be given the opportunity to introduce himself.
That's why David and I partner, because he's the good half.
I see you're talking about Kevin, Betcher, right?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Joined late, yeah.
I'm sorry, that's right, there are two Kevins.
That's somewhat unusual. Yeah, sorry, I was, joined late. A lot of commotion in my house having to do with contractors that arrive first thing in the morning and need attention. I have had a nice run at Vertex, tax technology company, doing business and organization development over the years. And I want to give a shout out to them that after a nice run, anyone is eligible for a sabbatical. So I just came off of 4 weeks of time to myself at the courtesy of the company. So it's a really nice benefit that is provided, and I want to give them credit to you all, just so you're aware of Vertex's.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.